Well, good morning. It's great to be with you this morning. I can't think of a better way to start a worship service than with Psalm 1, which is one of my absolute favorite psalms. And then the first song we did, Christ Be Magnified, is just spectacular. So what a great way to set the tone for today. I'm honored to be able to give the message today. Some of you may have been here back in October when I talked about the rich man and Lazarus. I'm not quite sure why Craig invited me to come back. He must not have seen the video, but, be that as it may, I'm here. So today we're going to continue the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. The Joseph story is my absolute favorite in the entire Old Testament for a bunch of reasons. First of all, there's lots of drama, family stuff going on, and lots of ups and downs. But probably most importantly, Joseph is one of the most sterling characters, has one of the most sterling characters of anybody in the Bible. We're coming to nearing the end of his story. Craig will be wrapping it up next week. So I want to remind you where we were last week when Craig talked about Joseph's ability to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and God elevated Joseph to the number 2 spot in Egypt to oversee the coming 14 years that were about to take place. So just as Pharaoh's dreams foretold, Egypt experienced 7 years of prosperity when Joseph was in charge of collecting all the grain and the other provisions to store up for the 7 years of famine that were going to take place afterwards. So let's pick up the story there. We're in chapter 42. We're actually going to start on the very end of chapter 41, if we can get the verses up on the screen. Okay, all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all the people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. So this is an interesting story. There's a severe famine in the land, and there's a text that we just read mentioned. Jacob did not want to send Benjamin to go with the other brothers because Benjamin was his youngest son. He's still showing favoritism, which is kind of what got this whole thing started with Joseph and the coat and all that kind of stuff. So I guess Jacob has not really learned his lessons about showing favoritism to some of his kids. Notice in verse 6 it says the brothers bow down to Joseph. Does this remind you of anything? Remember the dream that Joseph had at the very beginning of this part of the Joseph story? Guess what? That's exactly what happened. Let's look at the next section of the text. It says, as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men and not spies." "No," he said to them, "you've come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." So Joseph recognized them immediately. I mean, these 10 guys walk in, and he knows who they are right away. They don't recognize him. Well, why should they? It's been 20 years since they saw him, and Joseph was dressed in Egyptian garb. Last week, Craig mentioned that, the Egyptians had the habit of shaving their head and shaving their beards. Well, that's kind of the opposite of what the Israeli people did. And also Joseph was speaking through an interpreter, so they didn't know that he knew their language. And then probably the biggest reason they didn't recognize Joseph, why would they think that this great, powerful Lord who is, controlling everything in Egypt would be their brother. I mean, that would be the last person you'd expect to see that happen. So be that as it may, they didn't recognize who he was. Joseph accuses them of being spies, and let's pick up the rest of the text here. It said, Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies. And this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother, and the rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you're not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And then he put them all in custody for 3 days. So he treats them harshly, tells them to go back and get Benjamin. And again, Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother. There were 4 women, 4 mothers of the 12 sons, and Joseph and Benjamin were both sons of Rachel. And, for that reason, Benjamin had a special spot in Joseph's heart. So Joseph has him put in custody for 3 days, and then when he's released, he repeats the order to bring Benjamin back. And he has an interesting comment. Let's read the next section of text too, okay? Actually, let me see. I think I got there too early. We should have read this before, sorry. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother back to me so that your words may be verified and that you might not die." And this they proceeded to do. So what I wanted to point out, that interesting phrase up there, "Do this and you will live, because I fear God." Now, Craig mentioned last week that when Joseph was brought in front of Pharaoh, remember Pharaoh asked him, he said, "I've heard that you can interpret dreams." And Joseph said, "Well, I can't, but God can." So Joseph does the same thing here. He said he's pointing to God in a situation where he really didn't have to do that. He goes out of his way, it seems to me, to point to the fact that God is an important part of his life. And to me, his faith in God under the circumstances he's in is truly remarkable. He's been thoroughly steeped in Egyptian culture. Remember they had dozens and dozens of gods. He had no other believers in the true God around him. So where did his faith, where did his reinforcement of the things of God come from? I don't know. It's really remarkable. And it makes me wonder how faithful I would be in a situation like that, surrounded by totally pagan, totally non-Christian, non-supportive values. And this is the type of thing that often happens to young people when they go off to college or join the military. Or maybe you're in a situation like that at work where you may be the only believer, and maybe there are some unethical things that are going on, and you're asked to do things that violate what God would have you do. Joseph did a great job of providing a model for how to behave even in adverse circumstances. And if you recall, he said he was not willing to commit adultery with Potiphar's wife for a very important reason. He said back in chapter 39, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So again, he's pointing to God as the source of his behavior, source of his morality. And the only thing I can figure is that God must have made himself real to Joseph in a special way. And at the same time, Joseph had to be receptive to God's leading in his life and being obedient to the things that God was showing to him. So he serves as a great example of someone who acts and speaks righteously, but he's not doing it in an obnoxious or a forced way. It just seems to flow naturally out of his life. And to me, when I see somebody who very naturally and confidently and unashamedly identifies with God, I find that very attractive. So he's an example for me to try to follow, and I hope the same thing for you. Let's look at the next text. Okay? So the brothers said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They didn't realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. Joseph turned away from them and began to weep, but then he came back and spoke to them again. and he had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. So this is an interesting set of circumstances. All of the brothers recognize that what they had done to Joseph was wrong, and this was sort of a top-of-the-mind reaction they had. So they get adversity. The first thing they think of is, we're being paid back for something we did 20 years ago. So guilt had to be weighing heavily in their lives. Reuben turns around and chases the others and says, I told you we shouldn't have done that. So he acknowledges their collective sin. But then Joseph turns away, and it says he wept. And I always try to figure out why that was. Well, I think what it was that for the first time he recognized that his brothers knew that they had done him wrong. Think about that. He had 20 years to stew on that, to think, where are these guys? What are they thinking? What are they doing these days? He recognized that they knew that what they had done to him was wrong. And he also saw that Reuben had tried to stand up for him, so he had no way to know that before. So this was a highly emotional experience for Joseph. So here's what happens next. Joseph keeps Simeon in prison. He sells grain to the brothers. He sends them back to their father Jacob, but he also puts silver in their sacks, the silver that they brought to pay for the grain, puts it back in their sacks. When they stop for the night, one of the brothers opens his sack and sees his little bag of silver in there. He goes, oh my goodness, the brothers panic over this because Joseph had charged them of being spies, and this just feeds right into that. They think, okay, they're going to think that we're dishonest people, that we are spies. They eventually go back to Jacob and report what happened, and at that point they all open their sacks, and guess what? They all had their money back in their sacks as well, so this sealed the deal. They thought, we can never go back, because certainly they're going to accuse us of theft, and they already think we're spies. So let's read the next section, Genesis 42, verses 35 through 38. As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his patch of silver. When they and their father saw the money in the pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, you have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me. Then Reuben said to his father, you may put both my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him, meaning Benjamin, to my care, and I will bring him back. But Jacob said, my son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead. He's the only one left. That's interesting. He's the only one left. Wait, I thought there were 10 other brothers. But if harm comes to him on the journey you're taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow. So we can see that Jacob really hasn't learned his lessons. He says, I had 10 sons. I had 12, and I'm down to 10. Now you want to make it 9. And he says that Benjamin is the only one left. Reuben steps up and tells Jacob that he can kill Reuben's sons if he doesn't bring him back. But Jacob refuses to have this happen, so the brothers don't go back to Egypt right away. But as the story unfolds, the severe famine continues. And over the next couple of chapters, we see that the brothers do return to Egypt with Benjamin this time because they were so desperate for food. And they get grain, and they set off to come back home with more grain. And this time, Joseph puts his silver cup into Benjamin's sack. And then Joseph sends his own steward to intercept them. He finds a sack, hauls them back to Egypt again. And eventually, after a lot of rigmarole, Joseph eventually reveals himself, and they have a joyous reunion as a family. And they send for Jacob, and they're truly united as a whole family. So this story does have a happy ending, and I think it's a great example of how God blesses and honors a very faithful man who did his best to try to honor God in everything that he did. It's a great story, and I love it, but there's one aspect that always confused me, that I never quite understood. Why did Joseph not let his brothers know right away who he was? Why was he playing this cat and mouse game with them over a certain period of time? When I first read this story as a new Christian, it did confuse me, and I thought, well, this guy's supposed to be this great man of faith, and he's playing games with his brother and being coy and accusing them of stuff and all that. Shouldn't he have welcomed them with open arms? I mean, isn't that what a great man of God is supposed to do? Now I have a better understanding of that. I'm thoroughly convinced that we have two disadvantages in reading a lot of the narrative stories, a lot of the historical stories in the Bible. And I think this is especially true of the Joseph story. So there are two disadvantages we have in reading stories like this. The first one is that you can read the whole story in just a few minutes. Okay? Genesis 37 through 50 is the entire Joseph story. And you could read the whole thing in about 45 minutes. Joseph was in Egypt for about 20 years before his brothers showed up. And during that time, he had many ups and downs, some good times, when things were going well at Potiphar's house, and he's accused of trying to attack Potiphar's wife. And, we read that story, and it's no big deal for us because, okay, I'll get on to the next part and see that it all turns out well. Well, guess what? Joseph had to live that out day by day, week by week, year by year. And I want you to think through the last 20 years of your life and how many ups and downs you've had circumstantially, personally, spiritually. And you probably haven't had things as severe happen to you that happened to Joseph, being sold into slavery and being accused of adultery, being thrown in prison, being forgotten by Pharaoh's butler. So it's very easy for us to lose the fact that this was an extended period of time and he didn't know what the outcomes were going to be, which is my next point. The second disadvantage is that you already know the end of the story, right? Who doesn't know the Joseph story? If you were brought up in church and went to vacation Bible school, you probably had, the little flannel graphs with the colorful code and, all that stuff. So we all know that Joseph was going to be rescued from the pit. Did Joseph know that? We all know that he'll eventually get out of Pharaoh's prison. Did Joseph know that? We know that he'll eventually become the number 2 guy in all of Egypt. Do you think Joseph knew that? Of course not. And we also know that he'll eventually be reunited with his family. Did he know that? So because we know the end of the story, we almost certainly lose the emotional impact as the story unfolds. And one thing I have to remind myself, and I think we all need to remind ourselves, the Bible characters were real people. They're normal human beings. They had the same emotions that we did. And we have a tendency to romanticize the heroes, especially in the Bible. We've probably seen the nice little Sunday school brochures with the sanitized pictures and sentimentalized views of all these characters. Well, guess they were real people. They had tough lives just like you did, and they experienced the same emotions that you would in the same stressful situations that you have. So what I try to do when I'm reading these narrative stories, the stories that show what happened in somebody's life, is I try to put myself in that situation and ask myself, if this were happening to me, how would I feel? How would I react to these circumstances? And if you dwell on that a little bit, you can see that it really helps make the story real for you and you don't miss some of the emotional impact of that. So back to the question of why Joseph acted the way he did. What was his motivation for not revealing to his brothers who he was? One of my favorite preachers, Tony Evans, gives 3 possible reasons. The text doesn't really say, so we have to kind of read into that or try to figure it out. The 3 things that Tony Evans says: maybe it was payback for his brothers for what they had done to him. Maybe he was trying to arrange some circumstances that would force them to come to grips with their own evil actions toward him years before. Or maybe he was trying to set things up in a way to get his whole family back to be with him in Egypt. So I think those are all 3 possible reasons. I'd like to add a 4th one, and I think this one, in my mind, is probably the most important. Maybe Joseph needed time to process this shocking development. He wakes up one day just like any other day, and he goes into work, punches the clock, and all of a sudden, his 10 brothers show up in front of him. He hasn't seen them in 10 years. What do you do with that? Put him in jail. That's what he did. That's what he did. So that's an immediate first reaction. It's like, okay, this is brand new information, conflicted feelings. They're my family, but he needed time to sort out this new development in his life. Now, in some Christian circles, there's a belief that coming to know Jesus will help you solve all your problems. And of course it does. I mean, Jesus is the answer, as the old saying goes. But you know what? some of these folks don't believe that it's appropriate to get counseling. And the thought goes, when you come to Jesus, he'll help you address your problems. And if you see a counselor, that shows that Jesus is not sufficient to meet all your needs. And that's a poor testimony. You're making God look bad because you're going to see a counselor. Well, guess what? I completely reject that theory. And let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say there's a young girl, 8 years old, and for 4 years between the time she's 8 and 12, she's repeatedly raped by her dad. That's horrendous. There are very few things I can think of that are worse than that. Well, she eventually comes to faith in Christ. Do you think that she's not going to carry the scars of that for the rest of her life? Of course she is. And that's the type of person that can greatly benefit from Christ-based counseling. And just as an aside, we have several wonderful counselors here at Sanctuary, and if you're struggling with things that are beyond, you feel like you need some outside help, I strongly urge you to get someone an empathetic person who can help you work through that. You can call the church office and get names of people that can help you. Craig likes to say that we're a messy church, and he's right. And the reason I like that phrase is there are two aspects of that. First of all, we are messy, and guess what? Every church is messy, but not every church recognizes that. So the first step is recognizing your need, recognizing how messy you are. But then the second step is equally important. We don't wallow in our messiness because Jesus can help us get through that and work through that. It's a lifelong process of being transformed to be more like Jesus. So that's what Joseph is going through, I believe, in this incident. He's having to figure out what to do with the conflicted emotions, the scars and the hurt that he had been through because of what his brothers had done for him and all the subsequent events that happened after that. So this part of Joseph's story is all about forgiveness. And I have a slide that includes two important things to know about forgiveness. Let's take a look at that. First one is that forgiveness is me giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me, which is exactly what Joseph had to do. He had to give up his right to hurt his brothers because of what they had done for him. The worldly way is you hurt me, so I'll pay you back. I'll get you. Look what you did to me. Watch your back because you never know when I'm going to come up against you. That's the way the world reacts. Forgiveness is abandoning that right. And I once heard that the best way to tell if you've forgiven somebody, forgiven an enemy, or forgiven somebody who has harmed you, is you know you've forgiven them when you can pray for them the exact same things you pray for yourself. So what do you pray for yourself? Health, good relationships, a growing relationship with God, career success, financial success. If you can pray for that person who has hurt you that badly, the same things, and truly mean it, to me that's a real indicator that you've forgiven them. So the first point is that forgiveness is me giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me. The second point is that forgiveness is a choice, not a feeling. And unfortunately, it's a choice that many Christians have not made. I recently came across some information from the Barna Group, which does surveying of attitudes among Christian people. They determined in their survey that 23% of professing Christians say they have somebody in their life that they just cannot forgive. So that's nearly 1 in 4. So that means if this group is representative of that survey, that means 1 out of every 4 of you may have somebody in your life that you feel you can't forgive. And I think that's very tragic. It's understandable because the reason people feel that way, they may say, I have been so deeply, deeply hurt by this person, I can't forgive, and how could I forget that? And what they're doing in that case is misunderstanding what we mean by forgive and forget. Forget does not mean that I literally have no recollection of that. It means that I'm willing to put that behind me. I'm willing to close that door and move on with my life. So the first reason that it can be difficult to forgive is because we feel that the emotions aren't there, that I can't forget what that person's done. The second reason that it can be hard to forgive is that that person may be so unpleasant to be around. They think, why in the world would I ever want to spend time with that person? And I have news for you. You can forgive somebody and still hate spending time with them. So don't confuse forgiveness and reconciliation. And my next slide shows the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And that is, forgiveness is a one-way street. Forgiveness means I say to that person, either to their face or in my heart, you've wronged me, and by God's help, I'm willing to forgive that. I have forgiven that. But reconciliation is a two-way street, because you can't be reconciled to somebody who won't be reconciled to you. So I've talked to a lot of people that say they can't forgive and forget because they get these two things confused. And let me just mention something as an important sideline. In some cases, reconciliation may not necessarily be advisable, because there's some people that are just so toxic and they try to continually draw you into their sick little world. And for your own self-protection, you may need to keep arm's length, in a sense, to protect yourself, but you still need to forgive them. And the Apostle Paul offers some really good advice on dealing with difficult people. In Romans chapter 12, verses 17 and 18, he says, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. And here it comes. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. So again, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, that implies that it may not be possible, because the other person may not be in a position that you can live at peace with them, but you still have the obligation to forgive that person and do the best you can to reconcile if it's a healthy environment. It's not going to drag you down. Now, I've come to grips with a major need to forgive in my life, and I'm going to talk about a very personal example here. And the reason I'm telling you this is that you can understand the degree of forgiveness that was necessary for me to go through. And I'm going to talk about my dad some. He was a very troubled man, had many, many facets of dysfunctionality. He was a total nonconformist. He would not submit himself to anybody or anything or any kind of authority. He rejected the normal social protocols, totally lacking in social skills, weird behavior in public. His appearance was odd. For the last 20 or so years of his life, his entire wardrobe consisted of one-piece jumpsuits with matching clogs. So he had a navy blue jumpsuit, navy blue clogs. He had, a whole rainbow, green and brown and orange and red. That's all he wore for the last 20 years of his life. My mother tells us, he left our family when I was 12 and he remarried. And my mother tells a story, and this is secondhand, but I fully believe that it could have happened. It probably did. Apparently he and his second wife had a couple over one evening, and the subject of nudity came up. And being the nonconformist that he was, my dad thought, well, nudity's not a big deal. So allegedly, he gets up in the middle of the evening and walks in the other room and comes back stark naked. Now, I tell you, that's a conversation stopper, isn't it? So this other couple, of course, gets up and leaves. What do you do with that? So the bottom line is the guy was a complete embarrassment. He was fiercely anti-war, had deep mistrust of anything big. Big government, big business, big religion, big medicine. And in his mind, corporations were the ultimate embodiment of evil. And he and his second wife moved to mountains in Western Virginia to live next to a New Age research institute where they were involved in all kinds of very odd practices, and some of them I'm sure were demonic as well. So that's kind of the facts of his life. On a more personal note, let me tell you, what this meant for me. Like I said, I was 12 when he left our family. He gave no financial support, no emotional support. I did not ever get a birthday gift, a Christmas gift. Birthdays are supposed to make you feel special. This is your special day. A lot of cases like that, you have the Disney dad, who goes out of his way to shower the kids with all this stuff. He was the anti-Disney dad. He was a total narcissist. He was unable to enter anyone else's world. And my mom died a few years ago, but maybe 5 years ago, before she died, she told me this. She said when he was transitioning out of our family, he would only come home to eat and to sleep and to berate my brother and me. And for some reason, he especially picked on me. I had 2 nicknames. One was Idiot Child. So think about that. And I can't tell you the other name because it involves a word that you've probably never heard in a sermon on Sunday morning. So, that's what my relationship was with him. You couldn't have a serious conversation with him because he'd play word games. He'd pretend to follow your argument and then do something to completely undercut that, trying to trap you in some logic or some word thing or whatever. He ended up leaving our family, as I said, for a married woman who had 3 children of her own. And about 3 years ago, I met the youngest daughter of the 3. They were all completely messed up, all 3 of the kids. And we were trading stories about what it was like growing up with him. And I realized that he probably loused up this other family as much or more as he loused up our family. I also had an older brother, my only sibling, and unfortunately, he was schizophrenic. And he spent the last 20 years of his life in and out of mental hospitals. And back in 1995, he hanged himself while he was a patient in a mental hospital in Virginia where my dad lived. So Annette, my wife, and I went down for the memorial service, and as part of the time we were there, the psychiatrist who knew my dad because of my brother said to Annette, he said, "You know what, your father-in-law, meaning my dad, really should be in this place as well." So that was my dad. As an aside, can you imagine trying to buy a Father's Day card for somebody like that? Here's a word of advice from somebody who's lived on the wrong end of that. Be the type of person that it's easy to buy a greeting card for. And that's a variation of another saying, be the person your dog thinks that you are. So I couldn't buy a card that said, "You're such a great dad, you hold our family together, you're my hero, you're my role model." And I couldn't even buy him a humorous card because he had no sense of humor. So I was left with cards like, enjoy your special day. That's a pretty generic wish. So anyway, that's what I grew up with. So why am I telling you all this? It's not to trash my dad, but to show the level of dysfunctionality that I was subjected to and to paint the picture of a very flawed person who is in great need of God's love and my forgiveness. But the good news is that something happened along the way, and that's that I became a Christian when I was in college. And guess what? I wanted everybody to know about Jesus, including my dad. So over the years, we did their best to maintain a positive relationship with him the best that we could, stay in touch and visit, fairly frequently. Did we enjoy the visits? You can ask my wife. Absolutely not. It was horrible, stressful the whole time because you never knew when the next word game was going to happen. But we did it because we were trying to demonstrate the love of Jesus. Now, he died about 3 years ago, and I can honestly say that never once did I do anything to try to hurt him. We prayed for him regularly, and I really hope, I mean this completely sincerely, I really hope he's in heaven. He didn't deserve to be there, but guess what? Neither do I, and neither do you, because we don't get to heaven because we're great people. The only reason we get to heaven is because of what Jesus has done for us. What I deserve is condemnation and eternal separation from God because of my sin. And that's precisely why Jesus came. And anything that he gives me this side of heaven that's positive is an expression of God's grace to me. I have no indication that he ever realized that he needed Christ. He certainly heard the message over and over and over and over and over again. And, we have a great God, and it's entirely possible that maybe in the last breaths he took, God made himself real to him and he responded and repented of his sins. But let me remind you of the two truths about forgiveness. Forgiveness is me giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me, and forgiveness is a choice and not a feeling. And if these two sentiments are correct, which I truly believe they are, then I can say that I've forgiven my dad. Never developed warm feelings for him, never shed a tear when he died, but I really hope that I get to see him in heaven. I had to give myself permission to not like spending time with him. In fact, I hated spending time with him. And you may have somebody in your life that's devastated your life. And for what it's worth, I give you permission, I think God gives you permission to not like that person. But guess what? You still need to forgive them. Because forgiveness is a choice, not necessarily coming out of warm feelings toward that person. Joseph eventually got to the place where he was able to offer forgiveness to his brothers. He could have destroyed them. He certainly had the power to do that. And in the end, he made a choice to welcome them back. And as a bonus, God did restore the emotional side of their relationship. I'm going to ask you a question. I want to see a show of hands on this. Okay, raise your hand if this is true of you. How many of you have been sold into physical slavery by a family member and had that event set up a chain of actions that resulted in you being put in prison for years for a crime you didn't commit, and in the process lost 20 years of your life? Okay, let's see your hands. No, nobody? Okay, well, you know what? If God gave Joseph the grace to be able to forgive his brothers for what they did and set all these terrible things in motion, do you think he could give you the same grace to forgive that person or those people that have wronged you as severely as they may have wronged you? And I encourage you to pray for the grace to forgive those people in your life. And one more thing before I close. Maybe the most significant person you need to forgive is not somebody else. It might be yourself. Maybe you've done something absolutely terrible, something you would do anything to be able to take back. You relive the horror of whatever it is every day, and you feel like you've ruined your life. Although you can't necessarily undo the consequences of that, you need to realize that there's no sin that Jesus can't forgive and hasn't forgiven if you've gone to him, confess your sins, and recognize that he died for all of your sins, even that horrible thing that you would give anything to take back. So let me ask you this question. Are your standards for forgiveness higher than Jesus' standard for forgiveness? If you think about it, the answer has to be no. If Jesus forgave you, then how could you not forgive yourself? And there may be someone else that you need to forgive, and that's God. Maybe you've had some really tough times in your life, maybe a series of events that have been really, really hard. I know a few people that are probably going to join the Job fraternity in heaven when they get there, because they've just had thing after thing after thing go wrong in their lives. And it's easy for people to get bitter because of the crushing blows that they've experienced. But remember, I encourage you to stand back and remember what God has done for you. You and I deserve eternal separation from God because of our sin. But Jesus came specifically to take on himself the penalty that I deserve, the punishment that I deserve. And there's nothing I can do to buy that from him, no behavior I can do to earn that. I just have to receive that as a gift from him. And in return, all he asks is that, first of all, I trust him. Secondly, that I forgive him. And thirdly, that I do my best the rest of my life to reflect the way he wants me to live. You've probably heard a phrase around here that we're about what Sanctuary is a church where we learn to live and love like Jesus. And that's exactly what this whole thing about forgiveness is about. Because of my forgiveness, I can live and love like Jesus. And I'd like to close by reading one of my favorite parables. This is the parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18. Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, when my fellow believer sins against me, how many times must I forgive him? Should I forgive him as many as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, you must forgive him more than 7 times. You must forgive him even if he wrongs you 70 times 7. So that's, if you do the math, that's 490 times. That's a whole bunch. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who decided to collect the money his servants owed him. When the king began to collect his money, a servant who owed him several $1 million was brought to him. But the servant did not have enough money to pay his master, the king. So the master ordered that everything the servant owned should be sold, even the servant's wife and children. Then the money would be used to pay the king what the servant owed. But the servant fell on his knees and begged, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you everything I owe.' The master felt sorry for his servant and told him he did not have to pay it back. Then he let the servant go free. Later, that same servant found another servant who owed him a few dollars. The servant grabbed him around the neck and said, 'Pay me the money that you owe me.' The other servant fell on his knees and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you everything I owe.' But the first servant refused to be patient, and he threw the other servant into prison until he could pay everything he owed. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were very sorry. So they went and told their master all that had happened. Then the master called his servant in and said, 'You evil servant, because you begged me to forget what you owed, I told you that you did not have to pay me anything. You should have shown mercy to that other servant, just as I showed mercy to you.' Then the master was very angry and put the servant in prison to be punished until he could pay everything he owed. This king did what my heavenly Father will do to you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart."